18, chapters 51 to 53 of The Three Sisters by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 51. There was no prayer time at the Vicarage any more. There is no more time at all there, as the world counts time. The hours no longer passed in a procession marked by distinguishable days. They rolled round and round in an interminable circle, monotonously renewed, monotonously returning upon itself. The Vicar was the center of the circle. The hours were sounded and measured by his monotonously recurring needs. But the days were neither measured nor marked. They were all of one shade. There was no difference between Sunday and Monday in the Vicarage now. They talked of the Vicar's good days and his bad days, that was all. For in this house where time had ceased they talked incessantly of time. But it was always his time, the time for his early morning cup of tea, the time for his medicine, the time for his breakfast, the time for reading his chapter to him while he dozed, the time for washing him, for dressing him, for taking him out (he went out now, in a wheel chair drawn by Peacock's pony), the time for his medicine again, his dinner time, the time for his afternoon sleep, his tea time, the time for his last dose of medicine, his supper time, and his time for being undressed and put to bed. And there were several times during the night which were his times also. The Vicar had desired supremacy in his Vicarage, and he was at last supreme. He was supreme over his daughter Gwenda. The stubborn, intractable creature was at his feet. She was his to bend or break or utterly destroy. She who was capable of anything was capable of an indestructible devotion. His times, the relentless, the monotonously recurring, were her times too. If it had not been for Steven Rowcliffe she would have had none to call her own except night time when the Vicar slept. But Rowcliffe had kept to his days for visiting the Vicarage. He came twice or thrice a week, not counting Wednesdays. Only, though Mary did not know it, he came as often as not in the evenings at dusk, just after the Vicar had been put to bed. When it was wet he sat in the dining room with Gwenda. When it was fine he took her out onto the moor under Karva. They always went the same way, up the green sheep track that they knew. They always turned back at the same place, where the stream he had seen her jumping ran from the hill, and they always took the same time to go and turn. They never stopped and never lingered, but went always at the same sharp pace and kept the same distance from each other. It was as if by saying to themselves, "Never any further than the stream, never any longer than 35 minutes, never any nearer than we are now," they defined the limits of their whole relation. Sometimes they hardly spoke as they walked. They parted with casual words and with no touching of their hands, and with the same thought unspoken, "Till the next time." But these times which were theirs only did not count as time. They belonged to another scale of feeling and another order of reality. Their moments had another pulse, another rhythm and vibration. They burned as they beat. While they lasted, Gwenda's life was lived with an intensity that left time outside its measure. Through this intensity she drew the strength to go on, to endure the unendurable with joy. But Rowcliffe could not endure the unendurable at all. He was savage when he thought of it. That was her life and she would never get away from it. She, who was born for the wild open air and for youth and strength and freedom, would be shut up in that house and tied to that half paralyzed, half imbecile old man forever. It was damnable. And he, Rowcliffe, could have prevented it if he had only known, and if Mary had not lied to him. And when his common sense warned him of their danger, and his conscience reproached him with leading her into it, he said to himself, "I can't help it if it is dangerous. It's been taken out of my hands. If somebody doesn't drag her out of doors she'll get ill. If somebody doesn't talk to her she'll grow morbid. And there's nobody but me." He sheltered himself in the immensity of her tragedy. Its darkness covered them. Her sadness and her isolation sanctified them. Alice had her husband and her child. Mary had all she wanted. Gwenda had nobody but him. She had never had anybody but him. For in the beginning the Vicar and his daughters had failed to make friends among their own sort. Up in the Dale there had been few to make. In those few Mr. Carteret had contrived to alienate one after another by his deplorable legend and by the austere unpleasantness of his personality. People had not been prepared for intimacy with a Vicar separated so outrageously from his third wife. Nobody knew whether it was he or his third wife who had been outrageous, but the Vicar's manner was not such as to procure for him the benefit of any doubt. The fact remained that the poor man was handicapped by an outrageous daughter, and Alice's behavior was obviously as much the Vicar's fault as his misfortune. And it had been felt that Gwenda had not done anything to redeem her father's and her sister's eccentricities, and that Mary, though she was a nice girl, had hardly done enough. For the last 18 months visits at the Vicarage had been perfunctory and very brief. Month by month they had diminished, and before Mary's marriage they had almost ceased. Still, Mary's marriage had appeased the parish. Mrs. Stephen Rowcliffe had atoned for the third Mrs. Cartaret's suspicious absence and for Gwenda Cartaret's flight. Lady Frances Gilbey's large wing had further protected Gwenda. Then suddenly the tale of Alice Cartaret and Greatorex went round, and it was as if the Vicarage had opened and given up its secret. At first the sheer extremity of his disaster had sheltered the Vicar from his own scandal. Through all Garthdale and Rathdale, in the Manors and the lodges and the Granges, in the farmhouses and the cottages, in the inns and little shops, there was a stir of pity and compassion. The people who had left off calling at the Vicarage called again with sympathy and kind inquiries. They were inclined to forget how impossible the Cartarets had been. They were sorry for Gwenda. But they had been checked in their advances by Gwenda's palpable recoil. She had no time to give to callers. Her father had taken all her time. The callers considered themselves absolved from calling. Slowly, month by month, the Vicarage was drawn back into its silence and its loneliness. It assumed more and more its aspect of half sinister, half sordid tragedy. The Vicar's calamity no longer sheltered him. It took its place in the order of accepted and irremediable events. Only the village preserved its sympathy alive. The village, that obscure congregated soul, long suffering to calamity, welded together by saner instincts and profound in memory, the soul that inhabited the small, huddled, humbled houses, divided from the Vicarage by no more than the graveyard of its dead, the village remembered and it knew. It remembered how the Vicar had come and gone over its thresholds, how no rain nor snow nor storm had stayed him in his obstinate and punctual visiting. And whereas it had once looked grimly on its Vicar, it looked kindly on him now. It endured him for his daughter Gwenda's sake, in spite of what it knew. For it knew why the Vicar's third wife had left him. It knew why Alice Cartaret had gone wrong with Greatorex. It knew what Gwenda Cartaret had gone for when she went away. It knew why and how Dr. Rowcliffe had married Mary Cartaret. And it knew why, night after night, he was to be seen coming and going on the Garthdale road. The village knew more about Rowcliffe and Gwenda Cartaret than Rowcliffe's wife knew. For Rowcliffe's wife's mind was closed to this knowledge by a certain sensual assurance. When all was said and done it was she and not Gwenda who was Rowcliffe's wife. And she had other grounds for complacency. Her sister, a solitary Miss Cartaret, stowed away in Garth Vicarage, was of no account. She didn't matter. And as Mary Cartaret, Mary would have mattered even less. But Stephen Rowcliffe's professional reputation served him well. He counted. People who had begun by trusting him had ended by liking him. And in 2 years' time his social value had become apparent. And as Mrs. Stephen Rowcliffe, Mary had a social value too. But while Stephen, who had always had it, took it for granted and never thought about it, Mary could think of nothing else. Her social value, obscured by the terrible 2 years in Garthdale, had come to her as a discovery and an acquisition. For all her complacency she could not regard it as a secure thing. She was sensitive to every breath that threatened it. She was unable to forget that if she was Stephen Rowcliffe's wife she was Alice Greatorex's sister. Even as Mary Cartaret she had been sensitive to Alice. But in those days of obscurity and isolation it was not in her to cast Alice off. She had felt bound to Alice, not as Gwenda was bound, but pitiably, irrevocably, for better, for worse. The solidarity of the family had held. She had not had anything to lose by sticking to her sister. Now it seemed to her that she had everything to lose. The thought of Alice was a perpetual annoyance to her. For the neighborhood that had received Mrs. Stephen Rowcliffe had barred her sister. As long as Alice Greatorex lived at Upthorne, Mary went in fear. This fear was so intolerable to her that at last she spoke of it to Rowcliffe. They were sitting together in his study after dinner. The two armchairs were always facing now, one on each side of the hearth. "I wish I knew what to do about Alice," she said. "What to do about her?" "Yes. Am I to have her at the house or not?" He stared. "Of course you're to have her at the house." "I mean when we've got people here. I can't ask her to meet them." "You must ask her. It's the very least you can do for her." "People aren't going to like it, Steven." "People have got to stick a great many things they aren't going to like. I'm continually meeting people I'd rather not meet. Aren't you?" "I'm afraid poor Alice is what?" "Well, dear, a little impossible, to say the least of it. Isn't she?" He shrugged his shoulders. "I don't see anything impossible about poor Alice. I never did." "It's nice of you to say so." He maintained himself in silence under her long gaze. "Steven," she said, "you are awfully good to my people." She saw that she could hardly have said anything that would have annoyed him more. He positively writhed with irritation. "I'm not in the least good to your people." The word stung her like a blow. She flushed and he softened. "Can't you see, Molly, that I hate the infernal humbug and the cruelty of it all? That poor child had a dog's life before she was married. She did the only sane thing that was open to her. You've only got to look at her now to see that she couldn't have done much better for herself even if she hadn't been driven to it. What's more, she's done the best thing for Greatorex. There isn't another woman in the world who could have made that chap chuck drinking. You mayn't like the connection. I don't suppose any of us like it." "My dear Steven, it isn't only the connection. I could get over that. It's the other thing." His blank stare compelled her to precision. "I mean what happened." "Well, if Gwenda can get over the other thing, I should think you might. She has to see more of her." "It's different for Gwenda." "How is it different for Gwenda?" She hesitated. She had meant that Gwenda hadn't anything to lose. What she said was, "Gwenda hasn't anybody but herself to think of. She hasn't let you in for Alice." "No more have you." He smiled. Mary did not understand either his answer or his smile. He was saying to himself, "Oh, hasn't she? It was Gwenda all the time who let me in." Mary had a little rush of affection. "My dear, I think I've let you in for everything. I wouldn't mind I wouldn't really if it wasn't for you." "You needn't bother about me," he said. "I'd rather you bothered about your sister." Which sister? For the life of her she could not tell what had made her say that. The words seemed to leap out suddenly from her mind to her tongue. "Alice," he said. "Was it Alice we were talking about?" "It was Alice I was thinking about." "Was it?" Again her mind took its insane possession of her tongue. The evening dragged on. The two chairs still faced each other, pushed forward in their attitude of polite attention and expectancy. But the persons in the chairs leaned back as if each withdrew as far as possible from the other. They made themselves stiff and upright as if they braced themselves, each against the other in the unconscious tension of hostility. And they were silent, each thinking an intolerable thought. Rowcliffe had taken up a book and was pretending to read it. Mary's hands were busy with her knitting. Her needles went with a rapid jerk, driven by the vibration of her irritated nerves. From time to time she glanced at Rowcliffe under her bent brows. She saw the same blocks of print, a deep block at the top, a short line under it, then a narrower block. She saw them as vague, meaningless blurs of gray, stippled on white. She saw that Rowcliffe's eyes never moved from the deep top paragraph on the left hand page. She noted the light pressure of his thumbs on the margins. He wasn't reading at all. He was only pretending to read. He had set up his book as a barrier between them and he was holding on to it for dear life. Rowcliffe moved irritably under Mary's eyes. She lowered them and waited for the silken sound that should have told her that he had turned a page. And all the time she kept on saying to herself, "He was thinking about Gwenda. He's sorry for Alice because of Gwenda, not because of me. It isn't my people that he's good to." The thought went round and round in Mary's mind, troubling its tranquillity. She knew that something followed from it, but she refused to see it. Her mind thrust from it the conclusion, "Then it's Gwenda that he cares for." She said to herself, "After all, I'm married to him." And as she said it she thrust up her chin in a gesture of assurance and defiance. In the chair that faced her Rowcliffe shifted his position. He crossed his legs and the tilted foot kicked out, urged by a hidden savagery. The clicking of Mary's needles maddened him. He glanced at her. She was knitting a silk tie for his birthday. She saw the glance. The fierceness of the small fingers slackened. They knitted off a row or two, then ceased. Her hands lay quiet in her lap. She leaned her head against the back of the chair. Her grieved eyes let down their lids before the smoldering hostility in his. Her stillness and her shut eyes moved him to compunction. They appeased him with reminiscence, with suggestion of her smooth and innocent sleep. He had been thinking of what she had done to him, of how she had lied to him about Gwenda, of the abominable thing that Alice had cried out to him in her agony. The thought of Mary's turpitude had consoled him mysteriously. Instead of putting it from him he had dwelt on it, he had wallowed in it, he had let it soak into him till he was poisoned with it. For the sting of it and the violence of his own resentment were more tolerable to Rowcliffe than the stale, dull realization of the fact that Mary bored him. It had come to that. He had nothing to say to Mary now that he had married her. His romantic youth still moved uneasily within him. It found no peace in an armchair facing Mary. He dreaded these evenings that he was compelled to spend with her. He dreaded her speech. He dreaded her silences 10 times more. They no longer soothed him. They were pervading, menacing, significant. He thought that Mary's turpitude accounted for and justified the exasperation of his nerves. Now as he looked at her, lying back in the limp pose reminiscent of her sleep, he thought, "Poor thing. Poor Molly." He put down his book. He stood over her a moment, sighed a long sigh like a yawn, turned from her and went to bed. Mary opened her eyes, sighed, stretched herself, put out the light, and followed him. LII Not long after that night it struck Mary that Steven was run down. He worked too hard. That was how she accounted to herself for his fits of exhaustion, of irritability and depression. But secretly, for all her complacence, she had divined the cause. She watched him now, she inquired into his goings out and comings in. Sometimes she knew that he had been to Garthdale, and though he went there many more times than she knew, she had noticed that these moods of his followed invariably on his going. It was as if Gwenda left her mark on him. So much was certain, and by that certainty she went on to infer his going from his mood. One day she taxed him with it. Rowcliffe had tried to excuse his early morning temper on the plea that he was beastly tired. "Tired?" she had said. "Of course you're tired if you went up to Garthdale last night." She added, "It isn't necessary." He was silent, and she knew that she was on his trail. 2 evenings later she caught him as he was leaving the house. "Where are you going?" she said. "I'm going up to Garthdale to see your father." Her eyes flinched. "You saw him yesterday." "I did." "Is he worse?" He hesitated. Lying had not as yet come lightly to him. "I'm not easy about him," he said. She was not satisfied. She had caught the hesitation. "Can't you tell me," she persisted, "if he's worse?" He looked at her calmly. "I can't tell you till I've seen him." That roused her. She bit her lip. She knew that whatever she did she must not show temper. "Did Gwenda send for you?" Her voice was quiet. "She did not." He strode out of the house. After that he never told her when he was going up to Garthdale toward nightfall. He was sometimes driven to lie. It was up Rathdale he was going, or to Greffington, or to smoke a pipe with Ned Alderson, or to turn in for a game of billiards at the village club. And whenever he lied to her she saw through him. She was prepared for the lie. She said to herself, "He's going to see Gwenda. He can't keep away from her." And then she remembered what Alice had said to her. "You'll know some day." She knew. LIII And with her knowledge there came a curious calm. She no longer watched and worried Rowcliffe. She knew that no wife ever kept her husband by watching and worrying him. She was aware of danger and she faced it with restored complacency. For Mary was a fount of sensual wisdom. Rowcliffe was ill, and from his illness she inferred his misery, and from his misery his innocence. She told herself that nothing had happened, that she knew nothing that she had not known before. She saw that her mistake had been in showing that she knew it. That was to admit it. And to admit it was to give it a substance, a shape and color it had never had and was not likely to have. And Mary, having perceived her blunder, set herself to repair it. She knew how. Under all his energy she had discerned in her husband a love of bodily ease and a capacity for laziness undeveloped because perpetually frustrated. Insidiously she had set herself to undermine his energy while she devised continual opportunities for ease. Rowcliffe remained incurably energetic. His profession demanded energy. Still there were ways by which he could be captured. He was not so deeply absorbed in his profession as to be indifferent to the arrangements of his home. He liked, and he showed very plainly that he liked, good food and silent service, the shining of glass and silver, white table linen and fragrant sheets for his bed. With all these things Mary had provided him, and she had her own magic and her way. Her way, the way she had caught him, was the way she would keep him. She had always known her power, even unpracticed. She had always known by instinct how she could enthrall him when her moment came. Gwenda had put back the hour, but she had done (and Mary argued that therefore she could do) no more. Here Mary's complacency betrayed her. She had fallen into the error of all innocent and tranquil sensualists. She trusted to the present. She had reckoned without Rowcliffe's future or his past. And she had done even worse. By habituating Rowcliffe's senses to her way, she had produced in him, through sheer satisfaction, that sense of security which is the most dangerous sense of all. End of Section 18, recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.